The wind swept cold across the open plains of northern France, carrying with it the low hum of distant aircraft and the faint echo of war. Beneath that vast gray sky stood an old farmhouse, worn and weary from years of toil and weather. Its owner, Henri Duval, was a farmer, an ordinary man caught in extraordinary times. To the passing eye, his life seemed simple, tending to his cows, plowing the fields, mending fences, and surviving one day at a time under German occupation. But beneath those fields lay a secret that could have cost him his life, and the lives of every soul under his roof. It began in the summer of 1941, when the Nazi occupation had already tightened its grip around the French countryside. German soldiers patrolled the roads that once carried tractors and hay carts, and every farmhouse was under suspicion. The Duval farm sat on the edge of the village of Saint-Aubin, surrounded by wheat fields and apple orchards. Henri had lived there all his life, as had his father before him. His world had always been the soil and the seasons, until the war came and turned even the soil into a hiding place. The first soldier he hid arrived on a rainy evening in August. Henri had just finished feeding the pigs when he heard the sound of boots sloshing through the mud outside. He froze. For months, the Germans had been searching homes for fugitives and resistance members. Anyone caught harboring soldiers or partisans was shot without trial. Henri's heart pounded as he slowly opened the door. Standing before him was a young man in a tattered British uniform, mud streaked across his face, his hands trembling. "Please," the soldier whispered in broken French. "I need help." Henri hesitated. Helping him meant risking everything: his farm, his family, his life. But as he looked at the man, barely older than his own son who had been taken prisoner months earlier, he couldn't turn away. "Come," he said quietly, ushering him inside. The soldier's name was Thomas Reed, a British paratrooper whose unit had been ambushed during a reconnaissance mission. He had escaped capture and wandered for days, surviving on raw vegetables stolen from gardens and water from streams. Henri's wife, Elise, gave him soup and dry clothes, while Henri listened to his story in silence. That night, when the soldier fell asleep by the fireplace, Henri stayed awake, staring at the flames, knowing that hiding one man would soon lead to more. By dawn, he had made his decision. Behind the barn, where an old root cellar had once stored potatoes, Henri began digging. He worked quietly at first, using a lantern and a shovel, covering his progress with hay during the day. The earth was damp and heavy, but Henri's hands were strong. He dug for weeks, carving a small space beneath the field, barely high enough to stand. Thomas helped him when he regained his strength. Together, they reinforced the walls with wood planks scavenged from the barn and built a narrow entrance hidden beneath the floorboards of the tool shed. By autumn, the root cellar had become a bunker, a secret refuge big enough for 5 men. Henri stocked it with preserved vegetables, water barrels, and blankets. He installed a small vent that rose up through an old scarecrow's base, disguised in the middle of the wheat field. It was simple but ingenious, and it saved lives. Word spread quietly through the resistance network. Whenever Allied soldiers were stranded or members of the Maquis needed a temporary hiding place, the Duval farm became a waypoint. At first, it was 1 or 2 at a time. Then, as the war dragged on, more arrived: French, British, even a few Americans. Elise treated their wounds and baked extra bread under the pretense of feeding the farmhands. Their daughter, Marie, only 12, learned to keep silent when German officers came to inspect the farm. She played her part well, a shy country girl with straw in her hair, pretending not to understand a word of German. The Germans visited often. They liked Henri's cider and sometimes demanded food or supplies. Each visit was a test of nerves. The soldiers in the bunker would crouch in silence as boots thudded across the floor above them. The creak of the trapdoor would sound like thunder in Henri's ears, even though it remained firmly closed and hidden under a pile of tools. Once, a German sergeant paused right over the entrance, smoking a cigarette and spitting on the floor. Henri could smell the smoke seeping through the cracks. Only when the truck finally rolled away did he allow himself to breathe. One bitter winter night, a blizzard swept across Saint-Aubin. Snow covered everything: the barns, the road, the wheat fields, muffling the sounds of war. Around midnight, someone knocked at the door again. Henri opened it to find 2 men, one barely conscious, leaning against the other. They were Canadian airmen, their bomber shot down near Rouen. Without a word, Henri led them to the shed, lifted the trapdoor, and helped them down into the darkness. The bunker now held 7 soldiers, more than it was meant to. The air grew stale, the food scarce. Still, Henri refused to turn anyone away. If we stop helping, he told Elise, then what's the point of surviving this war? The men in the bunker became like ghosts of the farm. At night, when the Germans were asleep, Henri let them come out for air. They would walk among the fields under the moonlight, careful not to leave footprints in the snow. One of them, a Scotsman named McAllister, carved a small wooden cross and placed it by the scarecrow vent, a silent symbol of hope. No one ever spoke of it, but every man who passed through that place understood its meaning. In the spring of 1943, the Gestapo intensified their searches. Rumors spread that resistance networks were sheltering Allied troops in the countryside. One morning, a truck full of German officers arrived at the Duval farm. The sergeant demanded to inspect the property. Henri's blood ran cold. He led them through the barns, the fields, and the farmhouse, his face expressionless. The soldiers overturned furniture, poked pitchforks into hay bales, and even stomped on the floorboards. The bunker lay only a few meters away, silent as a grave. Elise stood by the door, clutching Marie's hand. The little girl's eyes were wide with fear. One of the Germans, a young officer with sharp eyes, noticed the shed. "What is in there?" he asked. "Tools," Henri replied calmly. "You may look if you wish." The officer stepped inside, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. He kicked at a few boxes and bent down to inspect the walls. His hand brushed against the edge of the trapdoor, just a thin layer of dirt and hay covering it. Henri's heart stopped. Then, from outside, another soldier called, "Kommen Sie schnell." "We found wine barrels." The officer straightened, gave Henri a smirk, and walked out. Minutes later, the truck drove away, the Germans laughing and singing, bottles clinking in their hands. That night, Henri went to the bunker and sat in silence with the men. None of them spoke, but every eye glistened in the dim lantern light. They knew how close death had come. The war dragged on. Supplies ran low. The Allied air raids grew louder in the distance, and the German patrols more desperate. Still, Henri and Elise kept the bunker secret. They grew accustomed to the whispers, the coded knocks, the quiet exchange of maps and messages. Once, a resistance courier brought news that the invasion was coming. "Soon," he said, "the Allies will return. Hold on." In June 1944, the sky thundered. Planes roared overhead, and the ground trembled. D-Day had begun. From the fields, Henri and his hidden soldiers watched the horizon glow red with fire. They could hear gunfire far away, the sound of liberation approaching. But with the battle came danger. The Germans, in retreat and rage, began burning farms and executing anyone suspected of helping the Allies. Henri knew it was only a matter of time before they came again. 3 days after the landings, German troops arrived in Saint-Aubin. This time, they weren't searching, they were destroying. They torched barns, shot livestock, and arrested farmers. Smoke filled the air as Henri saw the flames creeping closer to his own fields. He turned to Elise and said, "It's time." That night, as German trucks rumbled on the road, Henri led the soldiers from the bunker. They were armed now. Rusty rifles, a few grenades, weapons smuggled from the resistance. Together, they took positions in the orchard, using the farm's hedgerows as cover. When the Germans came, expecting no resistance, Henri gave the signal. The orchard erupted with gunfire. The battle was brief but brutal. The soldiers Henri had sheltered for years fought like men possessed. McAllister, the Scotsman, was hit but kept firing until his rifle jammed. Thomas Reed, the British paratrooper who had first arrived years ago, threw the last grenade before collapsing beside Henri's plow. When it was over, 5 Germans lay dead, and the rest fled into the night. The Duval farm was a ruin, but it had survived. When dawn came, the first Allied tanks rolled into Saint-Aubin. Henri stood by the bunker's entrance, the wheat field smoldering around him. A young American lieutenant climbed out of a jeep and saluted him. "You've done more than most soldiers, sir," he said. Henri only nodded, too tired to reply. The war ended months later. The soldiers who had hidden beneath his fields were either dead or gone back home. The bunker remained, empty and silent. Henri filled it with earth again, but the memory of what it had held never left him. Years later, when Marie was grown, she would bring her own children to the spot where the old scarecrow had once stood. "Right here," she would say, pointing to the ground, "your grandfather hid men who changed the world." And beneath that quiet field, where wheat once grew and the wind whispered through the grass, the earth still kept its secret. Because sometimes, the greatest battles of World War II weren't fought on the front lines, but beneath the fields, in the hearts of farmers who refused to surrender their humanity.